We're now going to take a look at the concept of forgiveness as it's indicated in Second Temple Jewish texts. So by Second Temple, we're referring to the time between Babylonian captivity, so when the first Jewish temple was destroyed, to the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. So that happens in AD 70. So between those two times, there was a great deal of development within Judaism, lots of diversity, and so some of the literature that we're going to look at has some different things to say about forgiveness. And this is important because Jesus is growing up in a Second Temple Jewish context. The first apostles are all Jews who are growing up in this Second Temple context. And so it's interesting to kind of look to see what are the ideas of Jews who lived during this period. So first of all, we notice that with God, that in a couple of sources, God is petitioned to forgive or turn away his anger from exiled Israel for her sins by stopping his punishment of them and freeing them. So in the text that I've listed here, Baruch is a text that would be found in the Apocrypha. 4Q504, this is a document from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so found at Qumran. The 4 stands for K4, and the Q there stands for the site of Qumran. And so this portion of a scroll found at Qumran and Baruch, both of these texts kind of give this same type of understanding about God, where God is petitioned to forgive or turn away his anger from exiled Israel. So both of them are, although they are imagining a time when Israel is in exile, even though these texts were written much later after parts of Israel or Judah came back to Jerusalem. And so these texts talk as if these are people who are living back then. And there someone is petitioning God to forgive Israel, to turn away his anger from them. They're in the midst of exile. They realize they've been there because of their sins, and they want him to stop punishing them and free them, to allow them to come back to the land. And the understanding is that if he will do that, then his name, the name of God and God's power, would be known amongst the Gentiles, would be known amongst the world. So this would be a great thing that would occur. So in both of these texts, it's as if someone is kind of bartering with God for him to bring about this deliverance, this freedom from them. And if he does that, then that is an indication that he has forgiven them. He has turned his anger away from them because he's no longer keeping them exiled. He's no longer keeping them in a situation under which they are suffering. We also find in another source, this is 4th Ezra. Now, 4th Ezra is technically just outside of the Second Temple period. Second Temple period technically ends around 70 AD, but 4th Ezra was written probably sometime at the end of the 1st century. But nevertheless, it reflects the kind of idea that still existed even before AD 70. And in 4th Ezra, it shows that some Jews think that since God is creator of all, that he does forgive. He blots out sins of all people, and not just Israel's sins, but every human being. Because if God didn't forgive, then people who sin would die. Now, in 4th Ezra, the author can understand that there can be people who aren't rebellious, who aren't sinful, who don't have a kind of a high, heavy hand. Now, we might use the idea or understanding that, well, everybody sins. Paul says in Romans that all have sinned, fallen short of the glory of God. But in 4th Ezra, the author kind of understands, well, there are certain sins that are high-handed, that are very intentional. Not everybody does that. If you do that, well, then you ought to die. So if God, wasn't forgiving and treated everyone who committed a sin with a high hand, then that means commit sin intentionally, then many people would be killed, and very few people, the people who just sin accidentally, would be left. So again, it's this idea that, well, God must be already really forgiving, or blotting out, in other words, not holding people accountable for sin, because he doesn't immediately kill everybody. So this kind of expands the idea of God's forgiving as not just being about stopping a punishment, but it is this idea of his kind of mercy and compassion to allow people to exist even though they are committing sins intentionally. So that's an illustration from 4th Ezra. Now there's a very interesting text that's found again at Qumran, at the Dead Sea. So here you have 4Q242. So in other words, they've numbered these scrolls. Lots of fragments were found there. And here is a little fragment. Scholars refer to it as the Prayer of Nabonidus. And in it, there's a Jewish diviner who comes to Nabonidus, who is a king of Babylon. And part of this is based on a true account, but part of this is fiction. And so this is about Nabonidus having a disease, maybe something like kind of leprosy. And so this Jewish diviner comes to him, and Nabonidus asks the Jewish diviner if he will forgive him of his sins. And what Nabonidus is asking then is really, will this Jewish diviner ask God to forgive him of his sins and release him of the leprosy that he has? And so this is very interesting, and some people have even used it to compare it to Mark chapter 2 and the healing of the paralytic, because here again it connects the forgiveness of sins with the healing episode. The other text that I listed here, it comes from the Jewish historian. So again, this dates a little bit after AD 70, but Josephus lived prior to AD 70. He was a Jew who was a part of the rebellion against Rome in the 60s, ended up being captured, but then later on wrote kind of this history of the Jews. AJ is short for the Latin for Josephus's work known as the Antiquities of the Jews. So this is kind of a history of the Jews, and he's going through biblical texts, and he's retelling biblical text. And when he gets to the story about Samuel, when the people want to have a king, and what God does when people want to have a king is he then punishes them for this request. And he sends hail and lightning constantly. And so the people realize that they have sinned against God by asking for a king. In other words, they want to be like the rest of the nations. And it's kind of a rejection of God being their king, the only king that they need. And so it dishonors God. And if you dishonor God, then that's a sin. And so they go to Samuel, and they basically say to Samuel, make God benevolent to them. Make him benevolent and forgive this sin. So the sin is the asking for a king. Now what's really interesting about this particular passage is, again, there's a debate among scholars whether or not forgive this sin is asking Samuel for them to forgive this sin. But more likely, what is meant here is the subject of forgive is God. So make God benevolent to them, and, or in other words, that is, make God forgive this sin. And he would forgive the sin. Indication or evidence that the sin is forgiven is stopping the hail, stopping the lightning, so stopping the suffering. So forgiveness of sin is then seen by this kind of release from suffering or pain. The last one that I'm going to just look at here briefly is from Pseudo-Philo. Philo was a very popular Jew, lived in Egypt. Pseudo-Philo means this is not written by Philo, but somebody in Philo's name, and in it God forgives Israel, who is his vine. He forgives Israel's sin by staying his anger and not extinguishing her existence. The author is saying he recognizes that God ought to forgive Israel. So this is written again around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, and is recognizing that God should not completely obliterate Israel. Israel is his vine. He can't choose another vine because no one would want to be his people, because if he already destroys one people, nobody else will want to be his people. And so he should stay his anger, and he should not completely obliterate them or extinguish them. And by not completely destroying Israel, God will have forgiven Israel for her disobedience, for not keeping God's law. So these texts gives us a little bit of idea of how Jews at the time of Jesus kind of thought about forgiveness and what forgiveness means. So I can just basically highlight a couple of major ideas that these texts tell us. One is that it is God is the one who forgives sins. Nobody is really being asked to forgive somebody else's sin. People don't forgive sins. God forgives sins. Second, God can and does forgive non-Jews. So forgiveness is not something that just goes with Jews, but again, there are certain things that God has a law for non-Jews, just like he has a law for Jews. And if non-Jews break the law that God has for them, then God will punish them for that disobedience, for their sin. Forgiveness is primarily associated with the ending of suffering or disease. So you are forgiven when you no longer suffer. And finally, for when God forgives, he is staying his anger against sin, or he's blotting out that sin for recompense. In other words, the sin will no longer, it may have been for a while, but it will no longer be, the person will no longer be held accountable to deal with pain or suffering because of the sin. And so these are some of the major ideas in the text that we've just kind of looked at.